Hello there and welcome. In this video, we're going to learn about dependency injection. First of all, we're going to understand what it is, why we need it, and then we're going to see how to use it in an actual project. So what is dependency injection? First of all, we need to understand what is a dependency. When I first heard about it, I thought that it has something to do with the library dependencies that we import into our projects, but it's not correct. A dependency is basically anything that our classes are dependent on in order to work. For example, if we want to use Firebase, we're going to have to create a Firebase instance. So we're going to create this instance inside a fragment, and it means that this Firebase instance is a dependency of the fragment because the fragment needs this instance in order to work. Or another example is if we want to connect a repository and use it inside a view model. So it means that this repository is a dependency of the view model. Okay? So with dependency injection, we basically can inject all of these dependencies into different parts of our code. So instead of creating instances of these dependencies, we can simply inject them and then use them. And it solves a lot of different things. It makes the code more efficient, and it really eliminates the need for a lot of chunks of code that we have to create if we're not using dependency injection. After you learn about dependency injection, you will never go back and you will never create a project without it because it makes everything much more simple, especially in medium and big apps. In order to use dependency injection inside our project, we first need to bring the relevant libraries. So first of all, we're going to go into our project build Gradle script, and over here we're going to paste and import this plugin. Of course, I'm going to provide all of these imports in the description section of this video. So we're going to bring this one and we're going to sync. And now that we have this plugin, we can go to our app build Gradle, and over here we're going to actually use this plugin. If you don't have this Kotlin capped, you also need to bring it. We already have it inside this project, but you also need to bring this plugin, okay? So now that we have this plugin as well, we're going to sync again. And of course, it didn't find the actual dependency. So we're going to go over here to the dependencies block, and we're going to paste a few more of these libraries. And we're going to sync again. And now we basically have Hilt inside our project. Now, it doesn't matter if you start a new project or you want to add dependency injection into an existing project. Each time, the initial part will be exactly the same. So we bring in these libraries, okay? And then when these libraries are inside our project, we need to create a few annotations in order to explain to Hilt the layout of our project. So we're going to use a project that I already used before in a different tutorial. If you've seen my MVVM tutorial, then this is the same project, okay? So we created a notes app and we added MVVM to it, and now we're simply going to add dependency injection to this existing project, okay? And of course, I'm going to provide you with the link in the description section if you want to check out this video. But it's just a simple notes app that has two different fragments, and we also have a room database inside. So of course, you can check out the MVVM video and see how we created all of that. So as I told you, after we brought Hilt into our project, we need to annotate a few things in order to tell Hilt that this is the way our project is structured, okay? Because without that, we cannot use dependency injection. So the first thing we want to do is create another package, and we're going to name it app. So inside, we're simply going to create a class that will be our application class, okay? And we're going to extend the application. And this class is useful for many things. In our case, we are simply creating it because we need to annotate it with Hilt Android app, okay? Without this, Hilt will not work. So we are not going to do anything inside the class itself, but we need to annotate it to tell Hilt, this is my application class, okay? And after we did this, we are going to go into the manifest, and over here, we're going to say name, and we're going to specify the application class of our application, okay? Now, there's a few more annotations that we need to do, and these annotations will go to all of our activities and fragments, okay? So we're going to start with this main activity, and we're going to annotate it with Android entry point, okay? So we can copy this and go to all of our fragments and add this annotation. So if you have more fragments or more activities, you need to annotate them, okay? Otherwise, it will not work. Now, an important thing to say is that if you have service classes inside your application, you also need to annotate them with this annotation, okay? We're not going to have a service, but if you're wondering, you also need to annotate services. Now, the next annotation will go to our view models, okay? So if you're going to inject something into the view model, you need to annotate them with Hilt view model. Now, there is an important thing to mention, and the thing is that if we're going to annotate a view model with Hilt view model, it means that we have to use dependency injection inside this view model. It means that we have to do this inject constructor. Of course, I'm going to explain to you what it means, but if you're not going to add this and you annotated the view model with this, then the program is going to crash, okay? So we're going to use it in both of our view models, I think. So we're also going to add this inject annotation. And of course, I'm going to explain to you what this means. But every view model should have this and also this, okay? So I explained to you briefly what is dependency injection, but if you never heard about it and never learned about it, I assume that you did not understand anything, and that's just fine because it was just a short explanation. Now we're going to actually learn how to use dependency injection. So as I told you, with dependency injection, we can inject all of our different dependencies into the different classes. And I also told you that a dependency is basically any instance that is used by the specific class. So for example, inside of this view model, we have this repository instance. It means that this repository is a dependency. Okay, and if we go inside of our repository, we can also see this nodes DAO. And it means that this nodes DAO is also a dependency because the repository needs it in order to work. It depends on it, okay? So this DAO is also a dependency. So if we had Firebase inside our project, we would probably create some kind of Firebase manager over here. So it was also a dependency, okay? But we don't have any other dependencies. We only have this database, this room database over here. So every room database has this database class, and then we have different DAOs, and then we also have a repository that talks with this DAO. And I hope you already have some kind of experience with the room database and you know what is a DAO and what is a repository. So with DAO dependency injection, we simply added this nodes DAO into the repository, and it was possible because the nodes DAO is just some kind of interface, right? And then we took this repository class and we created an instance inside our view model. But because this repository needs to receive a DAO inside, then when we created this repository, we also had to create an instance and we had to provide the DAO inside the repository constructor, right? And then to get the DAO, we had to create an instance of the database and get the DAO. So it was a bit messy, but that's the way to do it without dependency injection. But now with dependency injection, we can simply inject this repository into the view model, and then we don't need to do all of this, okay? So that's one of the things that is going to make our project more efficient and cleaner. So how do we actually inject a repository or any kind of class, okay? We're going to use this repository as an example, but it applies to any other class or any other dependency. So if we go to our repository, we simply want to inject this class into the view model, okay? And this view model is simply referencing and using this repository in order to do all kinds of queries, for example, add note, and in another view model, it uses the repository to delete the note, and what else? To get all notes, okay? So the view model is really dependent on this repository instance in order to work. Now, if we want to inject the repository into the view model, all we need to do is take the repository itself and simply inject it into the view model, okay? Now, because we're injecting this repository, we can use it as it is, and we don't need to create this instance anymore, okay? And it's going to work. Of course, right now, it gives us an error because it thinks that we need to initialize it, but we're going to solve this later. Now, we no longer need to do this, okay? We don't need to make it an Android view model. We don't need to use this application anymore because we don't need to get a reference of the database, okay? So we don't need this application reference, so we can remove all of this. And now inside this view model constructor, we're going to place our repository. We're basically going to inject it into the view model, okay? So now you can see that there is no more errors because we injected the repository into the view model. So because we injected into the view model, we don't need to create an instance of the repository anymore. And it applies to any other kind of class. For example, if we had a Firebase manager, we could simply inject it into the constructor of the view model, and then we don't have to create an instance of the Firebase manager anymore. And that's very useful, especially if we need to provide the instance with some kind of context or something else, right? So we don't need to do all of this anymore. We can simply inject it into the constructor. And the way we inject it is by simply creating this inject annotation and also this constructor keyword, and then it injects the repository into the constructor. So don't worry if it's still a bit confusing. We're going to do it a few more times with different classes, and I'm sure that it's going to be very clear when we're finished. Okay, so let's go a few steps back. If we open this drawable folder inside this project, we can find this UML. And this is just a graph of our entire app. And this is the way our app is structured, okay? We have a main activity, we have a home fragment, an add node fragment, and then we have both of these view models. And the view models are talking with the repository, and then the repository is talking with the DAO, and the DAO is talking with the room database. Okay, so that's a very standard MVVM application. nothing too fancy. So let's just start from the beginning. Let's go over all of these different classes and see if we can inject them, right? Because this room database is a dependency of this nodes DAO, and this nodes DAO is a dependency of this repository, and the repository is a dependency for both of these view models. This is the way a dependency works. You need it in order to work. Now, let's start with the database. Inside the database, we just create this abstract DAO, but we don't actually need anything to make the database work, right? We don't need to create any kind of instance. So there is no point of injecting anything into the database. So let's go into the DAO, okay? Inside the DAO, once more, it's an interface. We don't need to create any kind of instance or any kind of dependency to make it work, right? So there is no need for dependency injection inside of this DAO. Now, if we continue, we reach this repository. And inside the repository, we can finally see that there is some kind of instance created over here. Okay, so it means that we need this nodes DAO in order to do something. So instead of simply creating it over here, we're going to inject it into the repository. Inject constructor. And now we can see that there is this icon that appears over here. And this icon comes with the Hilt library, and it simply helps us to understand the different connections. Okay, so in the beginning, when you just start with Hilt, it's very useful to look at these icons because they can really give you a lot of information. So if we hover over this icon, it will say repository nodes DAO provides for home view model. And what it means that this entire repository class is getting provided to the home view model, right? Because inside the home view model, we injected the repository. And the reason the repository is actually injected into the view model is because we added this inject annotation, but also because we added this annotation over here. Now, it's something that can be a bit confusing in the beginning. The fact that we're using inject constructor over here gives us two different functionalities, okay? So the first thing it means is that we can inject different dependencies inside the constructor, okay? This is the first functionality. The second functionality is that we can actually inject this entire class into other parts of the app. So it's a bit confusing, but just know that it has two different functions, okay? Now we actually injected this nodes DAO into the repository. So now we can use it, but there's nothing special about it because we already used it before. Now, if we go to the UML, we can go further into the view models. So we said that we can inject the DAO inside the repository, but we can also inject the repository class itself into the different parts of our app because we have this. Okay, so if you have some kind of class, for example, a Firebase manager, and you want to be able to inject the Firebase manager into your different classes, then you simply need to add this inject constructor. And now, because we can inject the repository as well, we can go to the view model and we can inject the repository over here. So let's do the same thing inside the second view model. So we can get rid of this, and this, and this. And then we can inject the repository inside. So we can get rid of this instance. And we don't need this instance anymore. And we can see this icon, repository consumes repository. Now, this view model is consuming this repository. And this view model consumes the repository as well. But if we go to the repository and we hover, we can see that the description changed, okay? It says dependency related files for repository. So if we click on it, it will show us that now we have two different consumers, okay? The add node view model is consuming it and the home view model is consuming it, right? So we have one repository, but both of these view models are consuming it. So if we click on this, we can go to the different consumers. Now, because we no longer need to create an instance of the repository, there is no need for this DAO, and it means that we can delete this entire init block, okay? And also over here. And because we don't need a reference to the database, we can also go to our app database and we can delete all of this companion object that simply returned an instance of the database, because we're simply going to inject the database itself if we ever need to, okay? So there is no point for this companion object. And you can see that the class became much shorter. So this is what dependency injection helps us. It makes things much simpler. Now, there's something to understand. When we come to inject different classes, okay, for example, this repository or any kind of class that we want to inject, there are actually two different types of dependencies. The first type is a dependency that we have access to the actual constructor. Usually these are dependencies that we created by ourselves. For example, this repository, we created it, so we can go and do this inject constructor. We have access to the constructor. But in other cases, we are not going to have access to the constructor because the dependency will not be our own, okay? And a good example is again the Firebase manager. So usually we import the Firebase library and then we need to create an instance of the Firebase database. But this class, this object, is not something that we created. It's something that comes from the library itself. So we're not going to be able to inject it. We're not going to be able to go inside the class and add this part. So there's a different solution for these kind of classes. And if we're going to run our app right now, it will obviously crash because inside the repository, we are trying to inject this node's DAO. But have you noticed that there is no icon that is talking about the node's DAO? It simply says that these view models are consuming this repository class, but there is nothing over here about the node's DAO, right? But we wanted to inject the node's DAO over here. So it means that the node's DAO is not getting injected into our repository. And the reason is if we go into the node's DAO, we can see there is no inject annotation over here. So we cannot provide this node's DAO. And we cannot add an inject over here because it's an interface. So an interface doesn't have a constructor. I can try, inject constructor, but then it will tell us an interface may not have a constructor. And that's exactly what I was talking about. Some classes are not going to allow us to inject the constructor, okay? So how are we going to inject this node's DAO if we cannot annotate it with inject? For this, we're going to create another package and we're going to name it DI, okay? Dependency Injection. And inside, we're going to create a module. And we're going to name it database module because it's going to take care of all the different database related dependencies that we want to inject. Of course, you can create more of these modules. So in order to make it a module, we are going to annotate it with module, okay? So Hilt knows that this is a module. And then we're also going to add another annotation, install in singleton component class. And this means that we want to be able to access this module from our entire app. We simply install it inside the singleton component, and it means that it's accessible inside the entire app. We can use different components, for example, activity component. It means that we're going to be able to access it from our activity. So in our case, we want to be able to access it from our entire app. And now that we created this module, we want to be able to inject the DAO. So inside this module, we're going to create a method that will deal with it. So fun provide nodes DAO, right? Because maybe in the future, we're going to have a few more DAOs and not only one DAO. And we're going to call our app database, and inside we're going to find the DAO, okay? And then we're going to return it. Now, in order to find the DAO, we need a reference to the database. So for that, we're going to inject the database inside this method, okay? App database. So now we're going to inject the app database into this method, and then we're going to be able to find the nodes DAO, okay? And now that we find this nodes DAO, we can simply return it. Now, of course, it's not going to work because there is no way to inject the app database, right? Over here, we don't have any inject annotation, and we cannot add a constructor to this database because it's an abstract class, so it's not going to allow me to create a constructor. So again, we also need to create a method to provide this database. So provide app database. And over here, we simply want to create an instance of our database. So room database builder, we need to provide it with a context, okay? Let's just skip that. App database, we're going to provide it with the actual class, right? This class we have over here. And we're also going to provide it with the name, database name, and we're going to create this name as a constant over here. Private const okay, and now we can build this instance. And the only thing that we're missing is a context, okay? But there is no way to get a context from this module. So for that, we're going to once again inject something into this method. So you can see there is some kind of chain of injections. We're going to inject something over here, and then we're going to inject this over here, and then we're going to be able to inject the DAO into the repository. So we can actually inject a context into this method. And then we're going to be able to use this context. And that's a very useful thing that dependency injection is allowing us to do, to inject the actual application context. So we're going to do application context, and you can see that it's something that comes with Hilt. App context of type context. And we're going to provide this context into this database builder. And we also need to change our module to be an object, okay? And not a class. Oh yeah. And this. So let's understand what just happened. First of all, we wanted to inject the DAO into the repository, right? Because it's not enough to just say inject constructor and provide it with the nodes DAO. Obviously, we cannot see any kind of indication that it's actually working. So it means that we need to also provide the nodes DAO. But if we go to the nodes DAO, we're not providing it. And I told you that if we don't have access to the constructor, we need to find another way to inject it. So for that, we created this module. And over here, we're going to provide this nodes DAO, okay? And in order to get an instance of this nodes DAO, we need to have a reference to the app database, because the app database is the one that is creating this nodes DAO. So in order to get the nodes DAO, we're simply creating an instance of this app database. But in order to get this instance, we're going to inject the app database over here. And in order to inject the app database, we need to provide it as well. So over here, we create an instance of the app database, and the app database requires a context, so we also inject the context into this method. So now we inject the context and we create this instance, and then this entire method will provide the room database into this place. And now when we have this app database, we can find the nodes DAO, and then this method will provide this nodes DAO, and we're going to be able to inject it over here, okay? Now, you're probably wondering why we are not seeing anything, why nothing changed, right? And the reason is because these methods over here are simply methods and they're not actually used. In order to tell Hilt that we want to provide and use these methods, we need to annotate them with a special annotation. And the annotation is provides, okay? And also here. And now we can see that this icon appeared and it says app context consumes provide context. So over here, we're simply injecting a context. Now, we don't see that this app database is being injected, okay? So what's missing? We can change this to that. Yes, so let's also change that. And this is just a different way. We can do the same thing. It's just something maybe you didn't know about it. It's not related to dependency injection. So if we want to return this nodes DAO, we can say return, okay? But now it will tell us that maybe you want to change the return type because we did not specify any return type. So we can go over here and say we want to return a nodes DAO. And now it will work because this method simply creates an instance of the nodes DAO. But then we need to return this nodes DAO. Okay, so here we say we want to return a nodes DAO. And the same thing over here. We want to return a room database, but we also need to specify that we want to return an app database, okay? So now when we say that we want to return this instance, and this is the type of the instance, we can also see that we have a few more icons. But what I did before with the equal sign is basically the same thing. It's just a shorter way to do this. If you don't want to specify return, and if you don't want to specify the type of your return, you can simply remove these brackets, you can remove the type you want to return, and then you simply do this, and it will work the same way, okay? So this is exactly like doing this with the return and with the curly braces. Again, it's not related to dependency injection, it's something that is a part of Kotlin, and it's just a shorter way of doing things, okay? So you can leave it this way if it's easier for you to understand, or you can remove this. And it will be easier, okay? We can see over here that app context consumes the provide context, but we can also see that provide app database provides for provide nodes DAO. It means that this method is being injected over here, okay? It means that this instance is being injected over here. And then we can go over here and see provide nodes DAO provides for repository. It means that repository is consuming this nodes DAO instance. And now, of course, when we injected the nodes DAO over here, we can also inject the repository into the view models, and we can use it and everything will work. Now, in this project, we don't have any more dependencies. So we're actually done, okay? We injected the DAO into the repository, we injected the repository into the view model. If we had something else that we wanted to inject over here, we could simply inject it into this spot over here, okay? For example, if we wanted to use the location services, right? The fuse location services, we could simply inject it over here. And this is the way we use dependency injection. We simply inject the different dependencies into the part of the code that they're used. So if you have an instance over here of some kind of dependency, you can simply remove the instance and inject the dependency into the constructor of the view model. Of course, you don't really have to do it like this. Inside the view model, it's recommended to inject the dependency into the constructor, but in other classes, you can also do that. You can simply take this and say inject, okay? And of course, it should be a late init. So we still need to use this inject constructor because we want to inject the repository into the view model. But in order to inject the DAO, we don't have to do it inside the constructor. We can also do it this way, okay? In some cases, you don't want to inject it into the constructor. So you can simply inject it over here by annotating it with inject. And late init is because it's going to get initialized only when we actually use it, but I prefer to place it inside. Let's make it private. Private. Up until now, we've covered the most important parts and the most basic parts of dependency injection. You still need to go and to practice it a bit. You still need to inject different things inside your projects to actually get used to dependency injection, and then it's going to be very easy for you, okay? But we covered the most basic things. injecting things and consuming things. Now we're going to move to something that is not basic and you're probably not going to use it a lot, but it's still useful, especially in the specific situations that it actually applies. So we saw that we can inject interfaces like our DAO interface, right? We did this provides and we created an instance and we injected this interface. But in other apps, in other projects, sometimes we want to create different implementations of an interface. And if we have different implementations, we are not going to be able to provide them this way, okay? But we still want to be able to inject them, and it's possible to inject them. Now, it will be much clearer if I give you an example, okay? It's not something that we have to do in this project, but just for the sake of the explanation, I'm going to show you. Let's say we have our repository. And let's say that right now, this repository can only talk with our room database, right? It has these methods, and it always uses this DAO, and the DAO is a part of the room database. Now, what if we want to have some kind of other database, maybe a remote database, but we still want to use the repository and we still want to use the same methods, but we want to connect it to a different database. For that, we're going to have to make this repository into an interface, and then we need to create different implementations for the different databases. So one implementation will use these DAO methods, but another implementation will use the methods that will come with the other database. So let's see how it works. Let's copy our repository and create some kind of implementation. Let's call it room repository. And this just stands for implementation, okay? So room repository implementation. And we are also going to create some kind of remote repository implementation. Now, inside our repository, we are not going to actually specify the code that we want to use because it's going to be an interface. We're going to change it into an interface. We're going to remove all of this because obviously it's not possible anymore. And we're going to remove all of this. So now it becomes an interface, and we simply specify the different methods that we want this interface to have, okay? We're going to have some kind of method that will add notes and it will receive a note, some kind of method that will get all the notes and it will get a list of notes, it will return a list of notes, and then some kind of method that will delete a note and it will receive a note. We're not going to specify how we're going to do it, right? Because it's an interface. We're going to specify the ways to implement these methods inside the actual implementations. So inside the implementation, we're going to keep this code, but we need to specify that this implementation, it's simply a type of repository, right? We want to extend this repository. So we're going to extend, we're actually going to implement this repository. And now because we're implementing the repository, we also need to override these methods because the repository requires these methods. So we have them over here, but we also need to add this override annotation, okay? Well, actually not the annotation, but this override keyword, okay? Because the interface itself requires these methods, it means that the implementation has to implement these methods, right? And over here, we simply implement the methods. Now, inside the remote repository, we're going to do the same. We're also going to implement the repository, and we're going to add this override over here. And nothing is going to change over here. We're simply going to inject the nodes DAO into this repository implementation, right? But this time, because it's a remote implementation, we're not going to go to the nodes DAO. We're going to do something else. Of course, it's just for an example. We don't have a remote database. So maybe it's going to be something like remote database add node, and then remote database delete node. And over here, we're going to get all nodes, right? Get all nodes. And it's going to return a list of nodes. So this remote database instance is probably going to get injected over here as well, right? So again, we don't have it. It's all for the example. Private var remote database, and it's going to be some kind of remote database, or maybe some kind of other class that will go between the remote database and this repository. So the same way we injected this DAO, we're going to inject this remote database over here, and then we're going to access it and use all of these methods. Now, you can see that the methods themselves did not change, right? The signature is the same, but the implementation is different. Over here, we're going to access the DAO, and over here, we're going to access some kind of imaginary remote database. So we have two different implementations for this repository interface. So it's something that we do a lot of times in different projects, especially in bigger projects. Now, of course, it's going to yell at me because we're not returning anything. So let's just return a list of, okay? And now if we go to our view models, we can see that we no longer consume this repository. And why we're not consuming the repository? Because the repository is an interface. We cannot inject this repository. Yes, we can go over here and we can provide it like we did with the DAO and the database, but we don't want to provide the repository itself because it only contains abstract methods. We want to inject the different implementations. We do have this inject annotation over here. So why this room repository implementation is not getting injected into the view model, although it's a repository? Because Hilt doesn't know how to do it. And especially because Hilt doesn't know which one of these implementations we want to inject over here. So that's what this entire point is all about. If we have different implementations of some kind of interface, we cannot simply provide it by injecting it like that, and we cannot provide it by creating this provides method. We need to do something else. So for that, we're going to create another module, and we're going to call it, we can name it whatever we want. I'm going to name it interfaces module, okay? So this interfaces module will also be a module like this one, but it's going to deal with the different interfaces. And over here, we're going to do abstract fun provide room repository. Okay? And we're also going to do provide remote repository. Now, the way it works is that it receives the actual implementation, but it returns the type, okay? So over here, it's going to be room repository. Over here, it's going to be remote repository. And in both cases, it's going to return a repository. And this time, we're not going to annotate it with provides because it's not going to work. We're going to annotate it with binds, okay? And this binds is going to take this implementation and inject it into all the parts of our code that require a repository, okay? And of course, we also need to make it abstract because all of this is kind of an abstract module. So abstract class. And we also want to bind this because it's not enough to say that we want to install it into the singleton component. We also want to be able to say that both of these are singletons, okay? Now we can also see that this appears over here. So it says room repository implementation consumes the room repository implementation. So we inject the room repository class into this part. But then it also says that both of these view models are consuming this repository, okay? And what is the type? This is the type. And also over here, we inject the remote repository over here, and we provide this repository to both of these view models. So now if we go to the view models, and we can see this icon right now. So it says dependency related files, and we can see that the providers are both of these binds methods, provide room repository and provide remote repository, okay? So this is the way to inject the different implementations. Now, you may be wondering, how will it know which one to use? And that's the point. This repository, it's an interface, okay? So it doesn't matter which one of these implementations it's going to inject over here, because in both cases, we're going to be able to reference the repository and use this method, delete note, right? Because both of them have this method, delete note and delete note. The only difference is the way they implement the method itself. This room repository implementation uses the DAO, the room DAO, but the remote repository uses this remote database, okay? Now, of course, we don't want to leave it this way because we don't want to use them together. So how do we tell Hilt which one to inject over here? The way we do it is with another annotation, okay? But this time it's going to be a custom annotation. So we go into the interfaces module, and over here we're going to create our own annotations. So these annotations are going to be called qualifiers. So with them we can connect the different provide methods to the exact place they should be used. Okay, so over here we're going to create an annotation class, and we're going to name it room repository, and another one remote repository. And both of them are going to be annotated with this qualifier. So yes, we annotate the actual annotation. It's crazy. And now that we created these qualifier annotations, we can go over here and say that this one is the room repository, and this one is the remote repository. And the way to connect this one to the actual place it should be used, we simply take the annotation and we go over here and we add it to the actual spot it should be injected. Okay? So now if we go over here, it says repository consumes room repository implementation. So it no longer consumes this remote repository implementation. And we're going to do the same thing over here. So now both of them consume the room repository implementation. Now, if we want in the future to change the database, we can simply replace this with remote repository, and it will inject the remote repository implementation, and it will use the remote database. Okay? So that's the point. That's the way we do it. Of course, in our app, we don't have a remote database, so we can simply delete this entire class. And then we can also go over here and we can also remove this. Well, we can leave this, we can remove this, it doesn't matter. But of course, we don't need this anymore. And we can also delete this and it will still work because now it's the only kind of repository that is being provided. So if we go to the view model and we remove this, it will still consume our only implementation, right? So right now we don't need these qualifier annotations because there is only one implementation to be provided. So Hilt doesn't need to guess anymore. It can only provide this one. And of course, there is no point to have one implementation. We can simply use our default repository, but maybe in the future we do want to create another implementation. So let's just leave it this way. There's no harm to this. Okay, we have an interface of a repository and then we have one implementation. It doesn't really matter if we leave it this way, okay? And we can remove this. And we are not using this, so we can comment this out, just so you know that it exists, okay? And that's basically all. Of course, you need to practice it more. You need to find different kinds of dependencies. For example, if we had retrofit over here and we wanted to use it with dependency injection, then we would just create a network module and then create a retrofit instance and then inject it and create some kind of API manager instance and inject it. Okay, so that's the point. And we would use retrofit over here because we don't have access to the constructor of retrofit, right? It's not a class that we created. But if you want to inject a class that you created, you can simply go into the constructor and add this inject annotation, and then you're going to be able to inject your class. Okay, so that's pretty much everything about dependency injection. After you use it, after you practice it, after you add it to a few different projects, you will not be able to create a project without it. You will start every project and add Hilt as the first thing because it simply makes things a lot easier. And right now I cannot create a project without it because it simply helps me a lot. Okay. So now we can see that this node DAO is injected into the repository and the repository is injected into the view models. And if we had many more data sources, all of them could be injected into the different parts of our project, and it would really be very organized. And especially when we have these things over here, we have this app database provide. So if we need an instance of the app database somewhere, we can simply consume it from here, okay? And if we create another repository and we want to use this nodes DAO, we can simply inject this nodes DAO. And a good example is going to be in the next video that is not related to dependency injection, but it will still use this project, okay? The next part will be about creating a widget, okay? A home screen widget that is going to be added to this app. The widget will simply show the nodes list on our home screen, okay? So because the way a widget works, it's not some kind of fragment that is a part of the regular app. So we're going to want to inject maybe the repository into this widget, and then we're going to be able to use the different methods to get all the nodes and display them on the nodes list. So if you're interested in creating a widget and you want to know how to do it, then you can check this video out, okay? And of course, I'm also going to provide this entire project in the description section of this video. And I divided this project into different branches. So the first branch will be the initial state of the project. The second branch will be with MVVM, okay? And that's the way this project looked before we added dependency injection. And then I'm also going to add a branch with this dependency injection part that we added today. And we're also going to have a branch for the widget part, okay? So it's going to be an entire project with different branches according to the different development stages. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe if you're still not subscribed, and please leave a like. It will also help me a lot. So see you next time.